I'm going to need everybody to settle down right now. I'm going to start very, very soon. And by very, very soon, I mean right now. So if you're standing up, hello, there we go. If you're standing up, come find a suitable seat, preferably next to your friends we can discuss our topics of the day with. How are we doing today? Good? All right, sounds good. Well, everybody, welcome to GMT's 5th biannual showcase. I admit, it does look a bit barren here, but this is actually one of the most amount of people that we've ever gone. Not to say that that's a joke against us, it's to say that it's a joke against this room. This room is horribly big. I don't know why we do this room, but it has great acoustics, so I guess that's the reason, right? Well, for most of you guys who are going in either from Zoom or the guests that I haven't seen before, my name is Evan Putra. I am the Director of Research as well as the co-founder of Global Macro Team. As a bit of short introduction for Global Macro Team, we are a geopolitical and macroeconomic think tank. In fact, the only student-led undergraduate think tank on campus that does the type of research that we do. So you're in for a ride here today. Now, if you guys have attended any of our past conferences from before, you guys typically understand the type of research that we do, right? We conduct research that tries to prognosticate or forecast trends that are pertinent to current events and global events of the world, right? But this showcase will do the same thing with a twist. We prepared for you guys 4 different presentations from our 4 different teams, all of which are designed for you guys, the guests. And let me tell you why. So a lot of our presentations often come in the form of, I want to just say this thing. I want to tell you this thing. But there's been a revolution recently, right? The best way to present and the best way to make sure that our content is heard is by including you guys, right? Including you guys, the audience, and that includes you guys at home too, at Zoom. You guys are part of this audience. And we are very fortunate to have each and every one of you, hello? We are very fortunate to have each and every one of you come and attend our presentation. So we will pay that back by making sure that our content is not only just a regurgitation of what we've done, which is indubitably going to be interesting, but I'll let the research speak for itself, but also that you guys feel like you've learned something. And so if I can promise you one thing from tonight, it is that you are going to be learning some of those spectacular events and trends of the world that you would have known otherwise. That's my promise to you. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to be presenting today, right? But before I do that, actually, I want to talk about the people presenting today. Because although every one of you were probably invited by one person, you guys are probably unfamiliar with the demographic of GMT. So let me give you some statistics. In Global Macro Team, we have students ranging from majors in philosophy, international relations, plan to history, economics, computer science, mathematics, and business honors, amongst others. We also have students that come from Northern Ireland, Nepal, Kashmir, the Philippines, Indonesia, Canada, and Vietnam, among other countries and states and regions of the world. And last but not least, of course, with this diversity, without diversity in interests, we have people who are interested in working out, we have people who are interested in woodworking, we have people who are interested in yoga, we have people who are interested in taekwondo, among other interests. And so the reason why I say all of this is because I think one of the things that has really amazed me over the past 5 semesters about this organization is the community that we've been able to build, right? The people that we've been able to find and cultivate a shared passion with, these people are truly diverse in very many ways. And this leads to, of course, the topics that we are going to be presenting to you, diversity in the topics. We have in our agenda 4 different research teams. We have a team focused on Africa, we have a team focused on the US economy, we have a team focused on immigration, and last but not least, we have a team focused on the Middle East. Now, the reason why we have such diversity in topics is because we wanted to reflect the people that did the presentations, but of course, going back to my point in the beginning, you guys, the audience. At the end of the day, we're not only doing this research because we think it's fun and because we want to get good jobs where we can benefit from the skills we learn in this research, but it's to produce substantial literature through the pre-existing research base so that we can actually make an impact. So what you will see with a lot of our presentations today is that a lot of people will explain why their research is relevant. They will try to analyze the geopolitical and economic implications of their research findings, and they will recommend the financial or policy initiatives that they believe are concurrent with the findings that they have. And so I just want to conclude this opening by reminding you guys again of the theme that has been core to GMT for the past 5 semesters, which is the diversity. Diversity in people, diversity in background, diversity in topics, and diversity in thought. George Herbert Mead, the founder of pragmatism and one of the leading American psychologists in the 20th century, said it aptly by saying, society is unity in diversity. So I implore all of you guys to discuss with your peers, to be able to remember or to explore and analyze the trends that we see today, because we do really have some interesting research. I myself am amazed by the work that my peers have done, and so I hope you guys feel the same by the end of tonight. Thank you very much. So our first team on today's agenda is going to be the immigration and displacement team. Now, the immigration and displacement team is led by Grania Casey, our resident Queen Northern Islander. And not only that, she herself is a product of immigration. And in fact, so are all of us. Immigration is a topic that is, it's a topic that is ultimately incredibly relevant, even if you have stayed in the same country for the entirety of your life. I'm talking to you people here who have stayed in the United States for the entirety of your life. You have undoubtedly met some amazing people that have traveled the world or came from different parts of the world. And so today, the immigration team will explore and discuss how amazing this is in a geopolitical sense. Round of applause for them, please.
Hi, I'm Grania Casey, and this mic chose not to work just as I grabbed it. Testing. All right. So I am a sophomore majoring in economics and business honors. And before I get outed as the only one with foreign parents, every single person on this team's parents are not from the US. And I claim the Irish side a bit more than the Northern one. Don't know about the Queen part, but yeah. So we're the immigration displacement team. We also this topic because heck, it affects our lives pretty heavily. As Evan said, we're all the product of immigration. And more people are moving now than ever before. And so we kind of wanted to track what's going on and why. So this is, off to the next person.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emma Costa. I'm a freshman research fellow and I'm a business honors major.
Hi, I'm Vidya. I'm a freshman finance and economics major. This is my first semester in GMT.
Hey, I'm Raj. I'm a freshman Fin 2 major and I'm a freshman research fellow.
Can y'all hear us without the mic?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Maybe we shouldn't play the hot potato game.
Easier that way.
All right. So for this semester, we decided to focus on Haiti. We wanted to focus on Haiti because we had different topics to try and focus in on our research on immigration displacement. And our last one was climate migration. We all found that super interesting. And Haiti has some of the worst luck with natural disasters we've ever seen. So we decided we want to look into that and create this forecasting question to try and guide our research a little bit. So we ended up on what will be the percent change in net migration in Haiti from 2021 to 2022. We thought that would give us the best overview of kind of what's happening in Haiti and what we can do.
So let's just get into a brief look at our methodology. So, oh, that slide was in the wrong spot. Okay.
So this is our table of contents. We're going to start off as like just looking at our methodology and what we basically spent our semester doing. And then we're just going to go into the framework and how we kind of established our processes. And then finally, we're going to show you some key highlights of the research we did throughout the semester. And then we're going to go into the thoughts and the data behind our final projection and what that projected forecast was. And finally, we're going to show you some policy recommendations that we created.
So now we can take a look at our methodology. So first, we took our research question, net migration, and then broke it down into smaller parts so that we could organize our research much better in a process called verbalization. And then from there, we have our separate categories, and we decided to assign relative importance to them in a process called weighting. And after that, we took these divisions with the weights and try to focus on a hypothesis on how much each category will affect our research question. And then finally, from there, we took all of this research, highlighting all of the factors that are influencing issues in Haiti to construct a policy.
Here's to kind of look into our framework, kind of what different divisions we had or topics basically to guide our research to our projection. So we had our push and pull out of Haiti, and then our pull into Haiti, because we're researching net migration. Here they are listed up. We'll go into more depth later on.
So to start out with, the base rate for 2001 net migration of Haiti is negative 2.902 people for 1,000 people currently in Haiti. This is important. What we're really trying to track is how this net migration rate will change over this following year. Because what we're mainly focusing on is how the situation will get worse, how it will get better, which one will happen, and how migrants or potential migrants will respond to that.
Here's a kind of look into our push factors that we mentioned before. So these are push factors out of Haiti. That includes agriculture, such as manufacturing, and then under agriculture is the biggest sector of employment in Haiti. So a lot of Haitians are employed there. And whenever this is impacted, for example, if it's less viable to work in agriculture, as we've kind of seen as a result of natural disasters and then unsustainable farming practices, kind of destroying the landscape and arable land, people move to the manufacturing sector and see if it's viable to work there. And kind of mentioned human impact on the environment, such as deforestation and other things like that. And then infrastructure, a lot of the infrastructure in Haiti is kind of not sufficient for maximum production in agriculture. Storage facilities are lacking, roads are not great, and other things like that.
Our next category is natural disasters, which we broke up into foreign aid, deforestation, earthquakes, and hurricanes. So Haiti is in a very vulnerable spot to natural disasters because it is in the middle of a hurricane belt and it also lies on a fault line. So the first part, foreign aid, is just calculating how much foreign aid is coming into the country by other countries or aid organizations. And this impacts the amount of people moving because the government can use it to enforce rebuilding efforts, but it's been proven that this has not really made much of a difference because the government is really mishandling the money. It's not being put to good use. The next part, deforestation. Haiti has less than 1% of its natural forests left. And this causes a really big problem because plant life creates a really nice natural barrier that protects the landscape from disasters. And with earthquakes are a big deal. The 2010 earthquake was extremely damaging to the Haitian landscape, displaced a lot of people, and same with hurricanes. And especially with hurricanes, we researched this when we were researching climate migration, but the wind and rainfall from hurricanes are actually getting worse due to climate change. So we made sure to factor that into our research.
Our next division is politics. Recently, the Haitian president got assassinated and Prime Minister Ariel Henry went into place of him. And that created a lot of political unrest within Haiti. And with all that political unrest, it was basically two groups that split who thought that A, either the current Prime Minister Ariel Henry should stay in office, or B, there should be a new election held for a new president or head of state. And with all of that came protests, which led to state-sanctioned violence and things like that, which caused lots of conflict within Haiti between many political groups. And many other things that arose was like questioning the election integrity within Haiti and how the next election will be fairly held in order for there to be a fair chance for another head of state to be put into place of Ariel Henry.
Our final category was crime. This includes gang and non-gang related assaults. Gangs have actually, well, gang activities increased as a result of political turmoil and economic downturn. So we kind of wanted to research how that increase in crime has kind of made it that little bit more unpleasant to live in Haiti and pushed more people out.
So we'll also have to go pull out of Haiti. To reiterate, we just went over push factors. In other words, aversive phenomena that are pushing people out of Haiti. Now we're going to look at pull factors. In other words, positive things which are attractive force for people to move from Haiti to a different country. So connections abroad, this is a good thing for pull factors. It increases the strength of pull factors. So as the Haitian diaspora grows, in other words, the amount of Haitians living outside of Haiti, there'll be more reasons for people in Haiti to migrate. Maybe they have family and friends abroad. That chance will increase as the Haitian diaspora grows. And so we'll be estimating this based off of how the rate at which the Haitian diaspora grows. And we also going to look at the deportation from host countries that host Haitian migrants. Obviously, deportation is not going to encourage Haitian migrants, so this will have an adverse effect. The policy, if it's especially harsh, is going to deter Haitian migrants from migrating from Haiti.
Finally, we have pull into Haiti. When we're considering that migration, we of course have to consider people moving in. We found that the main factors are death in the family and humanitarianism. Obviously, there are different aid organizations, different programs where you can go to Haiti and work as a teacher, a doctor, engineers without borders, for example, Doctors Without Borders. And that's a kind of steady flow of people in and out. They stay for a few years, sometimes people stay for longer, come back. And then death in the family, we found that whenever someone in the family dies, and that person was the one who supported the family back in Haiti, some people have to move back to Haiti in order to become the person that supports that family that's left over. And so that's something we research when we're considering how people are moving back into Haiti. Finally, all of this research culminates into our projections. So we're trying to find out what each division or research category has, what effect it has on the 2022 net migration rate.
So the first things that went into this was the Fermi framework we made of our push and pull factors out of Haiti, which had to do with immigration, and then our pull into Haiti, which had to do with immigration. And the push factors were those agriculture, political, and crime factors. And the pull out of Haiti had to do with the two things that it just said, and the pull into Haiti had to do with humanitarianism and adaptation.
Basically, what these weightings mean are when patients are considering whether to move out of Haiti, how much does each category impact their thinking? So we decided 80% of it was being pushed out of Haiti, and then 10% was being pulled to host countries. And then finally, for immigration into Haiti, we gave it 10% because there's not that much immigration.
It's actually very little, which is explained by the push factors.
So for agriculture, it was given 10%. This is within the push out of Haiti factor, and would have an overall more negative impact on net migration. And it would cause net migration to become more negative, so more people will be moving out. We found that because the various issues like this, and they seem to be getting worse, which is why the 2022 one would be worse than 2021.
Yeah. And also with natural disasters, we gave that a very large weighting with 60%. And because natural disasters are a big deal in Haiti, it's one of the main reasons why people are displaced and end up having to leave because they don't have a home anymore. So that's why we gave it a negative projection, because that would mean more people are leaving Haiti. And we did this because hurricanes are getting worse because of climate change, and all the other categories, all the rebuilding efforts, every building and all the forests are getting destroyed faster than they can rebuild. So it's just kind of like a snowball effect where everything's getting worse and worse.
We gave politics 25%, and we had it negatively affecting how many people leave Haiti. And the reason we did that is because with political unrest comes a lot of conflict, whether it's violence or just groups of people who disagree with each other. And it's not weighted as high because these things aren't necessarily causing people to leave, but they can be the initial factor that creates conflict, which makes them leave eventually.
If you're feeling very depressed, don't worry. We had several meetings where we were like, God, poor Haiti. So that finally brings us to crime. So crime, we give it 5% because it does make standard of living slightly worse, but it won't have as much impact as you wouldn't leave the whole country because of crime. And so we found that gang violence is actually getting worse due to more political turmoil and other things like that. And so it was given a negative rating as well, meaning that it would cause more people to leave.
So for the pull out of Haiti, how recent changes have affected the strength of pull factors on Haitian immigration. So we have the pull of diaspora populations. I've made that mistake before in a meeting when I said diaspora, I said diaspora, that's pretty funny. So we estimated a negative 0.25. The way we estimated this was we took an interval for how much the Haitian diaspora is growing and how much migration has grown as a result of that. And we ultimately estimated that the effect each year of growth of the Haitian diaspora would be between either 0, very little effect at all, or negative 0.5% change. So ultimately, what we're seeing right there is the total effect on the weighting when you're not account for the 50% weighting. And we also have destination country policy. You're probably wondering, all these horrible things happen to Haitians. How are other countries responding? The US has given their answer. They have apprehended 30,000 Haitian migrants at the border and have deported thousands in the last year alone. There's actually a very new trend. Before the end of 2021, the amount of Haitians apprehended at the US-Mexico border was roughly 0. So the significant change so far has not caused an immediate impact in 2021, likely due to a lack of information from Haitians on deportation policy in the United States. I mean, how many Americans know about it? But we see that we forecast that the Haitians are actually coming back to Haiti will go back to their friends, their communities, their families, that ultimately have an impact on their perception of the likelihood of actually getting into the host country. I mean, the US is #1 host country.
All right, and then we get into pull into Haiti. We found that death in the family is actually a large percentage of why people would actually move back. And good news for once, COVID deaths are going down in Haiti. Bad news because of herd immunity because their vaccination rate is quite low.
1%.
Yes.
Less than 1%.
So since less people are dying, it's projected that in 2022, less people are moving back due to death in the family. And then humanitarianism, 0 change because a steady amount of people are always going in, steady amount going out. Not really going to change because you don't go to a country for humanitarian reasons because you think it's a great place to live. No shades for Haiti though. So that brings us to our final projection. So all of this research culminated into different calculations and finally into, we believe that there will be a negative 0.3884% change in net migration from 2021 to 2022. So that brings us to our policy.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background about why we chose our policy to be this way. As I talked about earlier, Haiti is really vulnerable to natural disasters, and despite having a lot of natural disasters, they're very unprepared for these disasters. So Haitian people are left really vulnerable during these times of disaster, and people often have time, like they get sick, they get injured because they're in these shelters or their house is getting knocked down. So there's a lot of factors that go into why disasters are such a big deal in this country, and we wanted to create a policy to keep patients safer and more healthy in the occurrence of a disaster.
So our policy is called the National Disaster Mitigation Agency, abbreviated NDMA. So we'll start with the funding of this policy. With any policy, you'll have to consider the feasibility of the actual project. So with funding, the largest bulk of funding, we base this mainly off of foreign aid to Haiti after the 2000 Haitian earthquake. Although bear in mind, funding used to be disproportionately large after more newsworthy events and close to 0 after tropical storms that hit Haiti that ultimately the US particularly out here about. But with funding, our largest amount of funding comes from governments. However, that tends not to be directed to nonprofits. It tends to be to the Haitian government or through deliberate projects that are Haiti. So it'll be hard to influence and ultimately won't benefit our organization. We are hoping to get some sort of corporate funding. Corporations donate anywhere from $25,000 to $500,000 to organizations operating in Haiti. The 2 most common organizations that receive donors are the Red Cross in Haiti and Hope for Haiti organization. Red Cross, for a long list of reasons, has some very efficient management. We can convince any one of these companies that are donating $100,000 to donate to our organization instead. It would make a pretty significant difference. There's also direct donations from other nonprofits and also an actual execution of what we'll be doing, which we'll talk about shortly. Collaborating with other nonprofits would ease expenses on all shoulders and indirectly be a source of funding.
Because we are the disaster mitigation agency, we want to create a lot of jobs for people in Haiti and not just use humanitarian aid workers to cover those jobs, but actually have Haitian citizens have employment opportunities through our agency. The issue with that, though, is that a lot of students don't really take the medical pathway in Haiti because it's such a strenuous pathway. So we want to implement different types of training in maybe high school or maybe even junior high school that inclines and encourages students to take that medical pathway and be ready to be employed at a disaster mitigation agency like ours. We're also trying to encourage new curriculums for students in younger grades to be encouraged to take a more medical approach to their career choice.
Yeah, and the next part is vaccination facilities. So when a disaster hits and people are moved into these shelters, a lot of people contract disease because they're in very close quarters and it's not very sanitary. But this is also because only 68% of the population has one or more vaccines. So that's why we wanted the NDMA to address this by partnering with aid organizations to create pop-up vaccination facilities that will be across the country and even in rural areas so those people can also get their vaccines as well.
That brings us to our final part, the contingency plan. So this would involve agreements between non-government organizations / aid organizations, businesses, and local governments in order to create facilities as well as have a plan for resource management. So all of this policy is just to kind of make life a little bit better in Haiti. Haiti is a beautiful country, and when we were searching up reasons why you moved to Haiti, every single one, the first one was like the people are amazing. So we hope this agency could try and make life a little bit easier by addressing one of the major problems we've found in Haiti. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Yeah, do you know what vaccine they use in Haiti as the primary means of vaccination?
I did research on this and like it's like pretty basic vaccines like the ones that you get here like as a baby. So I know one of them it's just like diphtheria was one of them, like tetanus, like those kind of like really basic vaccines. And sometimes people like they'll have like one and they'll be like,
What about the COVID vaccine?
oh, you have a COVID
Yeah.
vaccine? Oh, I don't know. I don't know what brand they were using. I'm trying to think.
Is it like the US brand or is it Sinovac or the Russian vaccine?
I do not remember, but I did read an article about how they made it really difficult for them to get COVID vaccines, and they got one giant shipment, and they took it to this hospital that was in a really crime-ridden area and was also overloaded with COVID patients. So people didn't go because they would have to go through this really crime-ridden area and then also run the risk of getting COVID in that one hospital because they only have. Do you also remember how many hospitals they had? It's definitely like 3. So
It's like 3 doctors for every like 1,000 people or
Yeah.
something
yeah,
like
it's
that.
like 2.0 doctors per 1,000 people. Yeah. So the whole COVID operation failed because of the way that they tried to roll it out. But with what we were trying to do is like scatter it out a little more and have like smaller pop-ups rather than one giant drop to a major hospital that's not in like a bigger.
With different size facilities as well. Also, fun fact, you need 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, and like up to 7 years of residency to become a doctor in Haiti. It's insane. It's like the US, but.
What implications does your research have on understanding other countries in similar situations also within the region? Did you find that your research opened doors to understanding any other similar issues perhaps experienced in other countries near Haiti?
We did find that there was a lot of money going into Haiti in terms of nonprofits on the ground. I mean, Venezuela itself donated, I think, $1.4 billion to building power plants, which powered like a fifth of Haiti after the earthquake. I mean, tons of stuff like that happened. However, ultimately, the executions of most of the projects that were announced, that you'll see in the news and all, ultimately influenced verification. I was talking earlier about the Red Cross. They had a $500,000 budget from this one particular donor, and they used it for this project called Rebuilding Neighborhoods, in which case I think they built 3 permanent homes that housed about like 260 migrants when they claimed to house around, I think, 140,000. So I think that's ultimately, when it comes to development economics in general, it's not the amount of money that's going in. There can be a lot sometimes. I mean, there's so many different contributors who are donating a somewhat substantial amount. It's about the execution, who's actually monitoring it, who's actually making sure that it goes as planned and there's not just
So you're saying your research makes you more wary of the processes of Asian countries? Is that what you're saying?
precisely. And against development economics, I think it's a very common trend that the application is really the thing that's really lacking. So it came from the past history of what historically has influenced migration in Haiti. It turns out that was almost entirely natural disasters and effects of agriculture, etc. We split agriculture, natural disasters, agriculture phenomena, independent natural disasters. Most agricultural phenomena in Haiti that are driving people to emigrate are from natural disasters. And then I think Roger influencing politics, we ultimately decided that despite recent trends, current political trends in the next year are very likely to impact migration.
Also, to start out with, when we first started reaching Haiti, we split into like a PESH framework, so political, economic, social, historical, to give us a good overview of kind of what's going on in Haiti and maybe previous causes. And so that kind of gave us a good idea of like a general context of Haiti to then go deeper into and find exact major problems in Haiti that would cause people to want to leave.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Other questions?
Up next, we have Team Africa, led by Sahana. And so Africa, perhaps out of the four major topics, maybe the one that you're least acquainted with. And that's because it has often been understated or underlooked as a research topic or as a topic of consideration. But behold, as the team will show you during their presentation, there are infinitely many gems in Team Africa and in Africa itself. And so please give a big round of applause to Team Africa.
But hi everyone, thank you guys so much for coming to our presentation. We are the African research team, and my name is Sahana.
Hello, my name is Gabe. My name is Adarsh.
And my name is Ian.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know you had. Before we get started, let's play a quick game. I need a volunteer. There will be somebody you. Yeah, Mauricio, why don't we do you? No, you can say, I mean, yeah, why don't you come up here? You can come up here.
Yeah,
Sure, why not?
come on, Mauricio.
Yeah, we can give her a round of applause. We're gonna do a little word association game, all right? So I'm gonna show something up there, and you're gonna say the person that comes to your mind.
Okay.
Wait.
Have a blue and black, right? Okay.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's the first one. Blue.
Yeah, blue, I guess.
Okay. George.
Yeah, okay, George. President, I guess.
Military.
Guns.
Country.
United States.
Terrorism.
Osama bin Laden.
Nice, thank you, Mauricio. You can run the ball. So among all those different things, Mali, and it's nothing about Mali was sort of mentioned. But Mali is ranked in the top 20 countries, top 20 most dangerous countries in the world. It has some of the largest, most active military and terrorist organizations, and it's impacted by some of the most powerful foreign entities, but it's so often overlooked. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to delve into how Mali's current military state affects its government spending and how it impacts the world.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with giving you guys some context on what exactly is happening in Mali. So Mali has been in turmoil since around 2012, and this has been due to conflict between Mali's armed forces and terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, as well as frequent coups and a lot of civilian protests against the government. And so in 2013, France decided to deploy troops into Mali to kind of help them fight terrorism, but this was largely unsuccessful. And in August 2020, Mali's military staged a coup and successfully took control of Mali's parliamentary government, and they're still in control to this day. And so, fast forward, last year, Mali's military junta, or military government, said that they would transition Mali into a democracy and hold elections in February of 2022. However, they changed their mind and delayed these elections by 5 years and still remain in power, which sparked a lot of backlash around the world.
Another reason we decided to analyze Mali was because of the trends in military spending over the last few years. Between 2019 and 2020 alone, Mali's military spent changed from $476 million to $580 million, which ultimately led our team to consider the forecasting question. What will be the percent change in Mali's military expenditure from December 2020 to December 2022? We chose to look at 2020 and 2022 specifically because we wanted to examine the cascading effects of the August 2020 coup that they had and the political instability it exacerbated.
To answer this question, we developed an extensive framework in order to forecast military spending. Our two main categories are domestic and international influences and economics. We believe that these two categories are extensive enough in order to drive Mali's military spending in the short term. So the first thing we're looking at is economics. And there are two main reasons why we chose this. First, country's economic backdrop definitely has a significant impact on their military spending. And second, Mali consistently ranks in the top 20 poorest nations in the world. It has extremely limited financial resources that they must allocate accordingly. And these are the three main subdivisions that we have in the economics division: sanctions, performance, and inequality. We believe that these internal and external factors drive military spending moving forward. So first, we'll go into sanctions. And a key assumption that we are making is that the military government, the Mali military government, places the survival of the regime over the survival of the state and will do anything in its power to keep hold of their power. So basically, placing economic sanctions on a military government is like telling a little kid not to do something. They'll do the exact opposite, which drives our assumption in this subdivision. So first, let's have an overview of the current sanctions that are placed on Mali. The first sanctions came in January of this year from ECOWAS, the Economic Council of Western African States. And then the second main sanctions came from the European Union later. We placed heavier importance on the ECOWAS sanctions, mainly for the reason that they are Mali's main economic trading partners. And second, those sanctions are broad-based, which targets the entire economy of Mali, compared to the sanctions that the EU placed, which only place sanctions on top military executives, such as asset freezes and travel bans. And these sanctions have definitely impacted their current economic performance. First, GDP growth. The current projections right now for Mali's GDP growth for this year have not reflected the sanctions that took hold in the beginning of the year. For example, the cotton industry makes up around 20% of Mali's GDP. However, cotton season is about to end in Mali right now, and they've only exported a third of what they have produced. So this is definitely a bellwether as to how GDP will underperform this year, coupled with economic underperformance and extremely limited financial resources. Mali has not been able to service its debts as of March 2022. They have missed around $200 million in interest payments, thus hurting their financial credibility in the world stage and unable to access loans. And yeah, so third, informal economy. Almost 3/4 of the country's workforce is employed in the informal economy, which has taken a hit due to the pandemic and will continue to underperform because of the current tensions that are happening right now. We can go back to economic inequality. So the trend that's been happening in Mali right now is that economic inequality is on the rise. For example, the poverty rate in Mali was 47% in 2014 and went down to 40% in 2019. However, due to the pandemic, all that progress was erased and the poverty trend has continued to go upwards. And there is obviously a lack of social safety net in the country. So if economic inequality trends up, that means social tensions in the country will increase. Thus, the military government will be more entrenched and continue to keep their power and allocate more spending to the military.
So the next sort of thing is, what does Mali actually use military for? To explain this, I'm just going to start with sort of a simple, very technical term, mad terrorism. So on the right, you can see that almost 60% of Mali is covered by some form of extremist or terrorist organization, the predominant ones being Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. On the left is a map of all the French outposts, and the blue things are the EU's CSDPs, which are common security and diplomacy missions that they have in there. These are basically the EU and the France's way of putting sort of counterterrorism measures in Mali. Next slide. This is the Global Terrorism Index, which is a scale from 1 to 10 that measures the indirect and direct impact of terrorism. And just from 2019 to 2020 alone, we can see almost a half-point increase in how much terrorism has impacted Mali. So, along with this increase in terrorism, Mali's commander, Assimi Goïta, decided to end their relationship with France in Operation Barkhane, pulling out almost 2,400 of France's troops that were stationed in heavily terrorist-occupied regions. This led to a really heavy increase in terrorist activity and also a decrease in Mali's efficiency in dealing with terrorists. Just this past month alone, there were almost 30 Malian military personnel killed. And in response to that, Mali decided to execute 300 of their own civilians under the guise of potential terrorists. With the increase in the terrorist impact in Mali, Mali's had to find its own ways to spend money on its own counter-terrorist issues, which someone will get into in a little bit.
Now, we all generally assume that the greatest threats to a country come from external factors like war or terrorism, but oftentimes the greatest enemies of a government come from the people within. Now, we've all been in history class. We know that popular opinion and protests can have a significant impact on how a country fares, whether in public policy or even by rearranging governments. Mali's government realizes this as well and has been taking steps since their May 2021 coup in order to ensure that their regime doesn't go down in history as the next one to fall to peaceful protest. When soon after the start of the coup, Mali's government started spreading numerous populist messaging and propaganda in efforts to convince people that the previous regime certainly didn't help anyone and definitely didn't help reduce the terrorist threat. Part of this practice involved banning 2 major French radio and television networks that reported critically on various human rights abuses the military committed in war-torn areas. This action specifically set a dangerous precedent for many journalists in Mali, who began to start self-censoring their works, something that no journalist should ever have to do, in fear of government retaliation. And taken together, these practices indicate significant increase in support for Mali's military. Where you would expect to see riots in the streets protesting the coup, the only major protests that we're seeing in Mali today are against the ECOWAS sanctions in favor of the military. Mali's government has successfully unified popular support in favor of the military, and such support will only result in an increase in military spending through a greater desire to have stronger military presence in the future.
So while domestic factors were critical to evaluate, we were also curious to see how Mali's foreign relations and other international factors shaped Mali's military spending. And so we identified the major players involved in Mali as the US, Europe, Russia, and international and multilateral orders. And then we split our research into looking at the monetary and non-monetary influences of each of these agents. So for time constraint purposes, based on our research, we predict that the impacts of the United States in aid from international and multilateral organizations will result in an increase in Mali's military spending into 2022. But I want to take a deeper look into seeing the impacts of Europe and Russia on Mali. Starting off with Europe. So France definitely had the largest stake in Mali. Over the past decade, they spent $70 million on their counterterrorism mission in Mali. And they also supplied Mali with thousands of troops, combat helicopters, and other military equipment. But when France withdrew troops from Mali on February 17, 2022, this symbolized a major loss in finances and military capabilities that Mali now has to figure out for itself. So France leading Mali also triggered Sweden, Denmark, Germany, to withdraw their troops and halt millions of dollars of aid to Mali. And so this substantial decrease in foreign military aid from the European countries will thus result in a substantial increase in Mali's military spending, because Mali now has to figure out a way to offset all these losses and make sure that its military is strong enough to fight against terrorists. So Mali was pretty stoked that Europe left the country. But once all these European countries started to leave Mali, they actually ended up leaving this massive power vacuum that someone by the name of Russia ended up taking advantage of and filling. So Russia's been pretty involved in Mali for quite a while. They actually supply 49% of all of Mali's arms. But Russia has slowly been increasing its influence in Mali through the use of Wagner Group. So Wagner Group is a private military company from Russia, and they're basically like the Blackwater. Mali has been working with Wagner Group since around December 2021, and Wagner Group has been in Mali to train Malian troops, provide security to the military government, and also make sure that there are no coups or any threats that could potentially take over the government. So I am curious, does somebody want to take a wild guess as to how much Mali pays each month for Wagner Group services? Shout out to them. Close, a lot. Okay, you were actually very close. Mali actually pays $10.8 million per month for Wagner Group services. And yeah, that's kind of a lot of money. But despite these high costs, it actually benefits the Malian government to continue working with Wagner Group on a militaristic and political scale. And with all these countries leaving Mali, Mali will therefore continue to work with Russia and substantially increase its military expenditure. And so the combined effects of these international factors will thus result in a substantial increase in Mali's military expenditure through 2022.
And taking these various economic factors into consideration, as well as domestic and international influences, we predict there to be a 6.094% increase in Mali's military spending from December 2020 to December 2022.
Now, this is a significant increase, and Mali's situation reflects a continual pattern of instability and insecurity in African nations being taken advantage of and exploited by foreign nations. And with that, thank you guys so much.
Any questions?
Oh,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and the mask.
So you
Oh, yeah,
predicted
sure.
about a 6%, you asked me.
Yeah, go.
Okay, awesome. So you predicted about a 6% increase in spending, but you also talked about multiple countries pulling out of Mali and cutting off the aid that they're providing. So where specifically do you see that 6% increase in spending coming? Is it like taxing citizens more? You mentioned the decrease in cotton trade. Where is that money going to come from, especially in light of paying other groups?
Yeah, so because the military actually has control over the government, and we didn't really touch on this, but there's really no oversight of the budget. And so we predict that the Malian military government is going to start reapportioning and reallocating money from other parts of the budget, other sectors, and putting that towards military spending, including taking development aid from like NGOs and other IOs and putting that towards military spending. So they're going to figure out some way to find the money for military spending somehow.
In the maps, yeah.
Did you research to what extent Russia's cooperation with Mali government will be affected by the Russian crisis? I know that the White House had the protocol material, but how many of their personnel they allocate to that?
Yeah, that's something that I personally been curious to see, like how Russian, whatever's happening with Russia and the sanctions is going to impact what they do overseas. And we didn't find there's not too much research on how that's going to be impacted based on the current political situation, but because Wagner Group is private, they may have different circumstances than if Mali was working directly with the Russian government. But something we're looking into.
Like the macro economic implications of spending, like this have some spillover effects in other parts of Africa. I guess at its core is why is this
So I guess in terms, I'll just frame it in regional terms in the Western African region. A lot of countries there, in Western Africa, have been susceptible to coups, and because of that, countries in that region are now seeing how Mali has been economically impacted, and are probably trying to get their internal politics, internal economics in order so that they won't end up being sanctioned and economically impacted like Mali.
I also wanted to add a note that right through the past, when they go to countries like the CAR or Somalia, they've actually exploited natural resources and minerals in exchange for payment. And that's something that other countries may see. You know, Mali is going to be exploited for its resources, and that's a lifeline for its economy. And so if this continues, it could really be trouble for other African countries.
Yeah, so out of curiosity, what's Mali's military relationship with the terrorist group that you mentioned earlier? Is Mali's military fighting like a two-front war against the terrorists as well as putting down civilian protests and arrests, or are the terrorists helping them in any factor? Like, what's the percentage of their attention is fighting against terrorists and the civilians?
So the majority of the military presence is against the terrorists. The protests aren't really against the Malian government. Like I was saying earlier, most of the protests are with regards to the ECOWAS sanctions that were placed on them. So that's not something really the Malian military is specifically concerned with. It's just sort of a product of the sanctions placed. So most of their the graph isn't up there anymore, but most of their military efforts are basically focused on the northeast section and the sort of middle section of the country where the terrorism is most influential. Yeah, Brian.
I'll name drop. You mentioned that the military can take away spending from aid organizations and things like that. Will that have an effect on how much you buy the Mali?
Well, currently, there's still, like, everyone in the world knows that Mali's going through conflict, but even today, like, there was a proposition, or not today, like, last month, there was a proposition of like $686 million of aid that is about to, like, go to Mali. And I believe that, like, aid is still going to increase, but oversight is not there, like, at all. So I don't think that it will necessarily decrease, like, how much aid or money's going to Mali. Yeah. And it's like developmental aid that's like due to corruption and like lack of oversight leaks into defense spending. And there's like literature that says that 11.4% of aid for development actually leaks into countries' defense spending budgets, especially due to corruption.
We're done. Sorry. Applause again.
Next, we have the Middle Eastern team. And what I find fascinating about the Middle Eastern team these past 2 semesters is that they kind of defy your expectations, what you expect to hear from Middle Eastern research. I mean, I'm not the first one to say, but I only think of violence, terrorism, etc. But there's, again, so much more, just like in Africa, so much more to this vastly interesting region. And today they will be talking about some of those lesser taught aspects. So I hope that you will open your minds and learn your perspective on the Middle East.
All right. Well, thank you, Evan. And thank you all so much for coming out here. We really appreciate you being here to listen and see what we have to share from a semester's work of insights, in this case, specifically into Saudi Arabia. And we had the pleasure of taking a look at Vision 2030, which we'll define in greater detail in a few moments. But we wanted to take a look specifically at what Saudi Arabia's economy is going to look like in the future. I know Evan mentioned that often we think of the Middle East in terms of security concerns, violence, terrorism, but there are many different societies here, and we specifically wanted to take a look at the Saudi economy in this case. So specifically, the question that we wanted to ask, as a petrostate, that is a country whose economy is strongly reliant on oil, natural gas, petroleum, what percentage of the GDP is going to be represented by petroleum in 2026? So obviously we're in 2022 right now. Vision 2030, well, is expected to be completed, or at least in the Saudi government's eyes, in 2030. So this represents a midway point to track the progress of Riyadh in achieving this particular initiative. So specifically, when we're looking to answer this question, we need to look specifically at the historical and geopolitical context, which I'm going to hand off to Porter to do right now.
So as many of you know, Saudi Arabia is a Middle Eastern country and it exists on the Arabian Peninsula. And it is a monarchical state that is also authoritarian and pretty much relies on petroleum for the majority of its gross domestic product. So touching on that, they are attempting to diversify their economy through the Vision 2030 initiative, which is spearheaded by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. What this is attempting to do is diversify their economy and give them other sources of revenue other than oil, so they no longer have to rely on petroleum for the majority of their economy and potentially not fall into the resource trap, and as well as are able to transition away from natural petroleum products, non-renewable products, in order to abide by international agreements on climate change.
And in terms of how they're actually going to achieve Vision 2030, it'll mostly be due to foreign direct investments coming into Saudi Arabia. Obviously, they're going to be domestically investing into this project, but a lot of it is dependent on outside governments investing in Saudi's future.
Right, perfect.
So ultimately, what we ended up doing was splitting up our data into quantitative and qualitative. And essentially, the way that we found out our quantitative data is, so our overall question is a number, right? It's what percent of Saudi Arabia's GDP in 2026 is going to be due to oil. So what we did was we found the data up till 2010 to 2022 of Saudi Arabia's overall GDP and how much of that could be attributed to oil. And then we just divided it to find a percent, and we got 42, right? And then we just created a regression model from there until 2026. And from there, we found out that it would be 42.27%. And just to make sure that the quantitative data could actually be trusted, we also ran a test to see how strong the correlation could be. Essentially, in more technical terms, how much of variability can be explained through the quantitative data. And the percent that couldn't be explained, we just left that to the qualitative data. And we found a pretty high correlation, actually. It was 68.8%. And that's when we realized that a lot of the data could be explained through the quantitative, and we could just use everything else to just adjust off of that.
Yeah, so just to kind of give you guys the background on that. So you guys have heard a lot about permeation throughout the course of these presentations. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about how we went about that process and how we answered such a huge question. So basically you can see this like beautiful little flow chart above me. And the idea behind permeation is that we break up a large question into many smaller questions and categories. So our two main categories were international and domestic politics, because ultimately, especially considering how heavily the Saudi government is involved with their oil production, these two factors are kind of what we wanted to fit everything else under. And then as we go along, we broke it up into smaller and smaller categories that we researched, so that instead of trying to answer the big question, we answered all of the smaller questions, and it allowed us to develop an answer for that largest question. No, so.
Yes, so this is all the proof of our quantitative data. So as you can see here, this is everything that we came up with. So if you think back to our original question, it's just what percent of the GDP can be attributed to oil. So the most logical way to do that is find out the total GDP and find out the total GDP from oil and just find out the difference there. So when running these tests, the main thing that we looked for was a lot of different data points. Actually, we ran demand, supply, OPEC demand, memos. We looked at how many barrels of oils were being sold and what the oil price was. And throughout everything, we found a really strong correlation through all the factors. And that's when we decided that we could just base the quantitative and qualitative factors off of each other.
Yeah, so now it's me. From there, we actually did some qualitative research to see what the trends were in terms of, not the numbers, but, what's happening politically. And one thing that impacted everywhere, very hugely was COVID. So Saudi and oil is interesting because it's not exactly what you'd expect when you look at the numbers of COVID, because so obviously oil prices plummeted, but they were actually stabilized by OPEC. And so they managed to maintain a higher base level than some other countries and some other oil-based economies. And because of that, after things started bouncing back from COVID, they actually sprung forward more, and they were able to reach pre-COVID levels of revenue back in, I think, the third quarter of 2021. So we saw recovery in terms of oil production bounce back a lot faster, which is not great news for cutting down the oil for Vision 2030. So you would have initially thought that COVID would actually help Vision 2030 and help to decrease that oil percentage, but ultimately it didn't wind up doing that.
Next, we considered the influence of OPEC and what they would have on the price of oil. And so OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they basically all meet together and decide how much oil to produce in order to manipulate the supply and therefore the price. And we also took a look into what climate action these countries are all going into be participating in, and we basically found that they're not really doing the greatest job with the climate and reducing petroleum production and trying to diversify their economies. So we decided that this is not going to have the greatest amount of impact on Saudi Arabia, the percentage of Saudi Arabia's GDP that comes from petroleum exports. And the second situation that we took a look at was the invasion of Ukraine. So as many of you know, this has caused a massive uptick in energy prices, mostly in the field of natural gas. But where this comes into play with Ukraine or Saudi Arabia is the fact that these energy prices are kind of unpredictable at the moment. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this war could go on for quite a while, and as recently as yesterday, Russia sanctioned Poland and Bulgaria, causing a huge uptick in natural gas prices in those countries. And so obviously, as energy is more expensive, it's going to be more profitable for Saudi Arabia and therefore disincentivize them from diversifying their economy away from petroleum and pursuing renewable options.
Right, and the other side of the coin specifically that we're going to be taking a look at is domestic politics. Obviously, international developments are going to have a huge impact on the demand, supply, et cetera, with respect to oil and gas. But of course, Saudi Arabia has its own political agenda. Its elites have specific goals that they want to achieve. Vision 2030 are, of course, that is of course the accumulation of a number of stated goals. But there's a lot of controversy specifically as to how genuine these goals are, right? So specifically, there's a kind of competing influence, almost you could say, with respect to Vision 2030 and a lot of the current or historical interests of the Saudi government, specifically when we look at the fact that this is a petrostate, it's an oil-based economy, and Saudi Aramco, which is the state-owned oil enterprise, has the second largest market value of any company in the world behind Apple. Is worth about 1.8, 1.9 trillion US dollars as of right now, and it's entirely state-owned. So this is, as you can imagine, a very lucrative economic asset for the Saudi monarchy. And so that really makes it a little bit more difficult for the current leadership to balance the interests of maintaining traditional economic strength and, of course, transitioning away to that more sustainable form of economic management.
Yes. Okay. So y'all know that TikTok meme where they're like, so tell me, like Saudi Arabia's economy is diversifying without it telling you it's actually diversifying. That's what Vision 2030 is. So how Saudi Arabia is going to actually achieve this goal, I suppose, is mostly through like obviously investment and a lot of foreign direct investment. And big picture numbers, I suppose, will give you that Saudi Arabia's 2030 goal is to raise $100 billion in foreign direct investments towards Vision 2030. Vision 2030, again, as Porter said, is like this futuristic kind of epitome of the diversification of Saudi Arabia's economy. And so this $100 billion goal in raising these funds, to say at least, has fallen a little short. Saudi Arabia's goal in 2020 was 19 billion, but they only raised 5 billion, which is really rough for them. Though they did invest 22 billion domestically, so that was kind of cool, but they're very short from their goal. And because of this, a lot of it is because of like, I don't know if y'all remember the Khashoggi killings for the journalists, and that has decreased their attraction towards outside investors. They've also had a lot of government corruption, which also explains a lot of the trustworthiness or lack of trustworthiness of Saudi Arabia's government. And so from all these kinds of factors, and Saudi Arabia is kind of very hesitant, I guess, like tangible actions towards their own goals. This has very much decreased other countries' I guess, own interest in Saudi Arabia and diversifying. Also, in raising like this money, it comes from a lot of Saudi Arabia's carrot and stick approach, sort of with real estate investment, medical investment, and finance investment. So an example of this would be Saudi Arabia forcing a lot of these companies to have headquarters in Riyadh, their capital, and then in turn promising a lot of money and profit going into those countries or companies from Saudi's oil funds. So you can see how this cycle is pretty counterintuitive. Saudi is wanting other countries or other companies to invest in them for not oil reasons, and then paying in oil money. So you can kind of see how this is probably not going to work out or pan out for Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so of course, this has to materialize in some way when it comes to predicting. And to make, to kind of simplify the way that we made this adjustment, obviously we have the base rate represented by our quantitative forecast, which has about the same percentage of GDP represented by petroleum 4 years down the line. Right now, 42%, very small adjustment up to 42.27% according to our model. So we used our qualitative model to make some slight adjustments to this measurement, right? The way that we did this is we specifically looked at these qualitative factors that we enumerated and went down them one by one with the way that we set up. IR, of course, receiving 58% and domestic receiving 42%. And we rated these categories on a scale from -5 to +5, with -5 meaning a highest degree of confidence that would decrease the share of GDP represented by petroleum, and +5, of course, representing absolute confidence that it would increase the share of GDP represented by petroleum. So both of these categories came out positive, which wasn't particularly surprising. IR had a little bit more of a pull, specifically with the Ukraine situation being a major question mark hovering over the, international petroleum market, and domestic politics. There's, a lot of the time apathy at best, and just, cynicism at worst among a lot of the elite when it comes to moving away from a very lucrative resource like oil. So of course, do the math, about a 2 percentage point increase in the expected GDP. So that means about 44.56% of the Saudi GDP will be represented by petroleum in 2026. So obvious implication, not going too well with Vision 2030, right? But hopefully we do see some improvements in the future. Obviously down the line, the Saudi government may recognize there's a bit more of an emphasis needed for change. Ukraine may pan out, and we might see things start to wrap up in the near future, but the uncertainty simply means that it doesn't look particularly positive at this moment for meeting that goal. So yeah, thank you all so much for listening in, and we'd love to take any questions. Yes.
Syrians, you know, I was so interested to hear how we usually associate violence with the Middle East. I'm just gonna take us right back to violence, talk about Saudi Arabia's position as, you know, as we all know, being in control of the world's oil. How will these changes with Vision 2030, as you stated before, diversifying away from reliance on oil, affect Saudi Arabia's ability to control, you know, legislation happening abroad, specifically thinking about JASA, how we got our lawsuit against Saudi Arabia because of their position as this oil mogul and their ability to threaten us with billions of dollars of damage. How do you see that affecting or getting affected by Vision 2030?
So because they're diversifying their economy, they're obviously going to have less of their profits coming from oil. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be producing less oil, because as the economy grows, I mean, they can produce the same amount of oil, and technically that sector of the economy would shrink. And then further, just geographically, they're very strategically located next to the Strait of Hormuz, and then also the Sinai Peninsula and the Sinai Canal. And so they have the ability to effectively close those choke points on the international economy at will, whether it be through naval actions or taking their air force and basically bombing anything that goes through them. So they still have a lot of leverage over the world's oil exports and the entire world's energy economy. So I don't think that their strategic position in the international arena is really going to change that much because of Vision 2030. If anything, it will improve because they may become more of a leader in renewable resources within the renewable sector. They may find themselves the bigger hub for tourism. They might actually see that they increase in strength internationally.
Any other questions? Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I know that Vision 2030 actually started 5 years ago. Did you guys actually touch on what progress has happened since the creation of this program? What have we seen in regards to petroleum or oil in the 5 years since this program was developed?
Yeah, so with a lot of the quantitative data that we looked at, the percentage of GDP represented by petroleum was relatively stable. I actually had the pleasure of looking through a lot of data on Saudi Arabian public spending with regard to economic diversification, and for the most part, it had grown quite a lot actually since before Vision 2030 was proposed. Obviously, with growing population, there became more of a demand for a lot of financial services. Infrastructure obviously needed to be constructed. So Saudi public spending had grown a lot since the turn of the 20th century heading into the 21st. But since 2017, it's actually started to plateau a little bit at around 150 to 175 billion dollars per year, more or less. So there's really, you know, it really remains to be emphasized exactly how much they're going to be making this effort to diversify. Any other questions, Matthew? I know you had a hand. What's up?
Yeah, I was wondering, Vision 2030 is aiming to transform Saudi economy and renewable energies. This requires like a labor force that's like more involved in Saudi workforce right now. To what extent would Vision 2030 change this how thinking this effort? Because I know that Saudi Arabia relies heavily on immigrants.
I covered a little part of this. The workforce in regards to increasing women's population in the workforce has increased in Saudi Arabia to achieve these goals, as you stated before. But in regards to like drastically expanding the workforce, I think their strategy will be to increase women's population and, as you said, like microbes.
Yeah, so I also researched this a little bit, and one of the things we researched was education. And actually, we found out that Saudi is doing very little to increase education, particularly in the fields that you mentioned. And they're pretty much maintaining their current system of education, and there's a lot of emphasis on religion. And additionally, there have been, even aside from Vision 2030, there have been recommendations from the UN for workforce, things such as a minimum wage, and thus far they've done none of them. So I think that it's not looking good on that front.
All right, perfect. So in the interest of time, I think that is going to be all for questions. Thanks again, guys.
All right, another round of applause for the Middle East team, please. And of course, we have one final team, last but not least, the US economy team. And so economics, well, first of all, I'm biased because I'm an economics major. But I find it to be one of the most fascinating fields because it is the study of humans, it is the study of us. And as we will find by the research topics that they cover today, it is something that will deeply impact all of us. So give a round of applause to the US economy team.
Good evening, y'all. My name is Faison. I'm joined by.
I'm Jack.
I'm Morgan. And I'm Bridget.
And we are the role of the U.S. government in the economy. And our, talk today centers around forecasting the 2022 Gini coefficient within the United States. You may wonder what that means. We'll get into it very shortly. So first, an interesting fact. The richest 1% in the world have more than double the wealth of 6.9 billion people. So that says a lot about the economic state of our globe. But how does the U.S. fit into that scheme? And we find that income inequality in the U.S. is the highest of all the G7 nations. And so it's a glaring problem within our society.
Faison kicked us off well, but I guess we'd like to address the question of why income inequality is worth studying in the first place. First of all, the US is doing very poorly compared to other countries when we look at income inequality. So that's one reason. Another reason is there's a lot of talk about racial and gender inequality, and we see that income inequality is actually the root cause of all other inequality. In that graph, we can see the wealth held by white people in the US versus Hispanics and Black people. So if we want to address those problems, we need to first address the wealth gap. And in case it's not obvious how important wealth is in the US, a study done by Georgetown shows that being wealthy makes you more successful long-term than being intelligent. So if you're born one thing, I guess you want to be born wealthy, which is a problem we obviously need to work to fix.
Next, we're going to dive into our methodologies, looking specifically at the Gini index. So this is essentially a number between 0 and 1 that just quantifies the wealth gap within a country. We can see that 0 would represent a perfect inequality and 1 would represent a perfect equality. This number is produced by the World Bank in conjunction with local governments of the company that they're producing the coefficient for. So within the US, that's going to be the Census Bureau. And on the next slide, we'll see a graphical representation of this. So some of you may know a Lorenz curve, which is essentially a graph that compares, lowest to highest income of people and then their percentage of the wealth that they hold, right? So the Gini coefficient is basically going to be the proportion in between the curve and what it would look like in a perfect society, right? Which would be the line of equality right there. And this leads us to our research question, which is what will be the value of the Gini index for the United States in the year 2022?
First, let's go into a bit of the background.
So to give us an overview of the history of wealth inequality in the US, to restate, the US is very behind here. On the graph on your right-hand side, we can see the ratio of mean to median income in all of the OECD countries, our peers, wealthy countries primarily. Over here on the right-hand side is the US with a very high ratio of mean to median income, which means that we are lagging behind, and we are the second most unequal country in the OECD country club. Problematic. And then we see this graph on our left-hand side, which shows that wealth inequality in the US has a U shape. We are approaching another peak in the U shape. So income inequality has been growing for the past 5 decades. And if we look at the years, we can also see that some social ills correlate with high income inequality because money is power. So if we want to avoid social ills, we need to bring that inequality back down.
So maybe no event in recent history, aside from perhaps the Great Recession, has impacted wealth inequality globally as deeply and severely as the pandemic. So as international economies have shut down, and supply chains have slowed. There's been a massive loss of low skill and low wage jobs, which has primarily affected low earning individuals. At the same time, this paired with a booming stock market has allowed the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. Another interesting event to look at would be the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And you might say, like, isn't war generally associated with, booming economies and swelling middle classes? Like World War II pulled us out of the Great Depression, but that's only really true if you're involved and winning, and we're neither of those things. And so, great or drastic increases in food and energy prices have further contributed to these economic supply chain slowdowns. And this doesn't bode particularly well for income inequality, with many popular hypotheses acknowledging that there might be a slight correction as countries come from COVID, but that it'll generally likely widen. There's also a lot of literature on this topic, as I'm sure you can expect. And generally the consensus is, as I stated, that it'll likely widen and increase. It's not looking good. The American middle class has shrunk from 61% to 51% since 1950, and it will likely continue to do so. And the top 20% of earners have greatly increased their wealth, with the bottom 20% actually contracting by about 20% since 2008.
So now let's go a bit more into our forecasting methodology and some results we have. So we want to do two things. First, we want to forecast the Gini value for the United States in 2022. But also we want to determine which socioeconomic factors are the most impactful in, I guess, decreasing or increasing wealth inequality. And so how can we do this? We're going to use what's called a lagged regression model. So you may be wondering what that means. And so essentially we're using values of the factors of 1 year to predict the Gini of the very next year. So consider year K. We use the values for year K's features or factors that we're soon going to talk about, and input that into a model that predicts the Gini for the year K plus 1. And so that creates two separate opportunities for us. First, we can plug in the values for last year's factors to determine what this year's Gini would be. So by plugging in 2021 values for all of these factors, we can get an estimate for what the year 2022 Gini prediction will be. But additionally, the magnitude and the statistical significance of the model coefficients will also allow us to determine which factors are the most impactful in determining the Gini coefficient. But we still have a problem. We need some factors.
So we approach this problem by taking the more traditional route, which is sitting down and brainstorming which factors we think will affect the 2022 Gini coefficient. We divided these factors that we brainstormed into 3 different categories. The first being government-driven, which includes tax rates, political dynamics, for example, which party controls the House or the Senate or the presidential office. In addition to public health, which is things like government outlays on health spending or health funding in general, as well as immigration. The second category is individual-driven factors, which are individual choices regarding whether or not to be employed or whether or not to pursue further education. The third category of factors are market-driven, like macroeconomics and investment, for example, what the S&P 500 is looking like that year, as well as socioeconomic trends, which is kind of a catch-all for a lot of things like the unbanked rate, for example.
And so now the next step we did was we collected data surrounding all of these different factors. And so we got a plethora of different information, such as yearly real GDP, S&P 500 return, the number of Democrats and Republicans and other parties inside the House and Senate, as well as college completion and high school completion among adults. But we wanted to make sure we only took the factors that really impacted the Gini coefficient. And so thankfully, computers allow us to do this. And so by using R, we were able to determine a set of all of those factors that would actually contributed to a powerfully predictive model. And so this was our final model. We have around 8 different predictors, and we generated an R squared of around 0.86. So what that means is 86% of the variation in Gini coefficient yearly can be explained by these factors. And so what are some key takeaways that we got from our model? First, we predicted that our 2022 forecast for the Gini coefficient was 40.30. And so that's actually a strong decrease from 2021's value at around 48. But we think that the United States can do better. And so two of the most impactful factors to income equality in our analysis were labor force participation and college completion. And so we believe that these should be the focal points of any remedial policy.
So looking at some policy recommendations for college completion, we can first focus on some goals. First, we want to find a group that is specifically impacted by, say, like high barriers to entry for education. And this can be through finding those specific socioeconomic groups. Secondarily, we need to find, what those barriers are, right? So we can combat them. And finally, we can look at providing funding in order to lower those barriers. So how we would actually implement this would be providing additional funding in order to gain more data on what groups are actually impacted. One example of this would be the National Center for Education Statistics. They provide, I would say, every 5 years a report that pretty accurately quantifies this. So additional funding would allow them to produce this more frequently. Additionally, increasing just the ability to go to school debt-free from the government side. So scholarships, grants, that kind of thing is definitely important for lowering those barriers. And then finally, increasing education funding at the public level, so K through 12, just to give everyone, a fair share when they go to college, right? Part of the issue is that sure, you may enroll, but job route rate needs to be considered as well. You need to actually complete the degree, and this can be done through programs like Robin Hood, where you basically just kind of make a more equitable choice with tax credits within space and school funding.
In terms of labor force participation, probably unsurprisingly, the best way to get people to want to work is to pay them more. And we can do this through policies that can be split up into two distinct categories: pre-tax and post-tax. So pre-tax policies focus on primarily making the workers more payable. And that means training, promoting education, and doing things along those lines. Post-tax policies primarily focus on actually shifting wealth from corporations and wealthy individuals to low-income individuals. And that's primarily done through supplementing market wages through the tax and transfer system, or expanding policies such as the earned income tax credit, which is essentially just a tax rate of about $1,500 to $6,000 per year for families making under like $57,000.
So that wraps up.
You mentioned in one of the recommendations increase funding for public high schools. Did y'all purposefully exclude funding for charter schools? Was that ever considered as a possible solution?
For charter schools, I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah. So I noticed y'all specifically mentioned public funding for public high schools as one of the solutions to reduce inequality. Did y'all purposefully exclude funding for charter schools, or was that ever an option?
I think that's a difficult question because I think some charter schools are considered public and some are considered private, right? So I guess as far as funding, that will probably be two separate sectors of the government. It's definitely something to consider, but I would assume that just kind of general K-12 education would be a larger proportion because it's usually based on a lottery system for charter.
And to follow up on funding, would that involve kind of funding? I know it's based on income taxes, household taxes.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of an advantageous suggestion just because it is right now funded primarily at the state level. I think around 90% of funding comes from the state level, and this would kind of suggest that we need to have a better federal handle on that. There are as I mentioned, a couple of programs within Texas where they kind of do your suggestion. They take a really high tax bracket within a district that has a high tax pool, right, and give money from there to an income to a school district that has a lower income bracket, right? Which I think is definitely a good program. It's just not national right now, so we're kind of suggesting that we can.
Yeah, just wanted to ask specifically, how much influence did immigration, for example, have on wealth inequality? Because after Hart-Celler, you saw an increase significantly in immigration to the US and also a growth in wealth inequality. And a lot of that is just because immigrants tend to come to the United States because of pull factors, usually because of the economic opportunity, and they tend to be disproportionately working class, low income as a result. How much of an influence did that have on impacting wealth inequality in your analysis?
Yeah, so we did include net, I guess net migration as one of our factors, but throughout the model selection, like the computational model selection process, it was actually eliminated. So it didn't offer as much explanatory power. That doesn't mean it necessarily doesn't have an impact. It may have been represented through other factors such as labor force participation rate and whatnot. And another factor we considered was the proportion of jobs rolled out were skilled versus unskilled. I think immigrants are probably, I guess, from some areas more likely to take unskilled jobs, and from some areas more likely to take unskilled jobs. Yeah, so although it didn't really make it into our model, it may have been represented through a variety of other factors.
Another question. Did y'all consider inflation rates or consumer price index into your model? Because it's been established that like being poor is expensive. Inflation hits the poorest the most.
Yeah, the consumer price index was factored into all. I did see that.
Yeah, that's kind of like loosely under the umbrella of like access to debt for education, I would say.
The what? And one thing I will point out is you have to be very careful in interpreting coefficients as well as their statistical significance, because a lot of them are correlated with each other. So as you have more coefficients that are correlated with each other, the interpretability of each singular coefficient is a lot less, important or understandable. So do take those with the grain.
One quick numerical question. What was the Gini coefficient that you used for 2021? What was the result from the model?
What do you mean?
As we said, it's number between 0 and 1. That's what Gini coefficient is. I didn't see the number that your model was still out.
Oh, the output. Yeah, sorry. So between 0 to 1, but think of it as 0.4029.
Oh, okay, yeah, that was confusing.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. Well, that was the last part of research. Another round of applause for all the teams this class. And again, that's capping our semester off, but also capping our year off. And so to conclude our year, our 2.5 year of existence in GMT is George Rao, the president of GMT himself.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I cannot get out of Canva right now. So if you guys will, the arrow, this thing. See, it doesn't work. There we go. All right. I want to show you. So my name is George. I'm president. I want to show y'all this statement, right? So this is our purpose statement. And but before that, let me ask someone to do something. Okay. So how about Porter? Can you blow like this? Okay. Whoa. And that's to symbolize that the presentations today really blew me away. Really did. No, really did. Okay, so I'm a finance major, right? And that means that I would like to think about the world in terms of capital, in terms of, you know, capital makes the world run in the mind of financiers. But one kind of capital that I think a lot of people don't really consider is when you think of capital, you think of what? Exactly. Okay, good one. Okay, you right. Human capital. What percent of the world's, say, capital would you say is in human capital? Okay, it's a high percentage. It's like over 50%. Right? Think of all the land, all the buildings, all the patents in the world, everything that makes the world valuable. That's nothing compared to human capital. And the reason I say this is because what we're here to do is this organization is here to develop human capital. You know, this is our purpose statement: ask questions, be curious. We're here to learn. And you know, today our research teams really did that. They asked the big questions about the world. The questions were specific, but they led to broad areas of research where they really became curious about how the world works. And finally, we hope that through this kind of learning, they will develop the knowledge and the skills to one day be the human capital that changes the world. Right? So, for our research teams, can we please give a big round of applause to their hard work. Apart from our research teams, we also have members of this organization that are part of research. These members support the organization and make the organization's culture what it is and support the entire functioning of the organization. So if you're a member of admin or a mentor of the organization, can you please stand up and be recognized? Please. So these individuals, you can see they're not dressed up, you know, and they're working behind the scenes to make this work amazing. And then finally, to our audience members today, who are here today, this would not have been possible without you. So please, everyone, give a big round of applause. Thank you, and thank you for all your insightful questions. Okay, and now this is the end, but I do want to leave one last thing, which is that the fire started here today, but we're gonna pass it on. So let's start playing that one song, all right? And you guys can walk out, get some snacks. Thanks for coming.
People in GMT stay for some logistical analysis. That's the dudes and the girls in the streets.
Oh, people over Zoom, thank you so much. Okay, bye, Juan. Thank you. Thank you for coming.